Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. And we are going to begin today. I'm actually excited about this, to pick up with our Ephesians series again. We've been at it for a long time. I've been taking some time off, and I think just a few more sessions will be done with the book. And what I'm excited about is that we'll have this on the website. We have a page dedicated to the Ephesians series, and it's just kind of like a completion, that we've gotten through this book together. So we're going to dive in a bit of an exegetical message because the text is very complicated. So hang in there. We've got slides and everything like that. Just a big picture overview, just to catch us up to speed, a few bullets. The first three chapters of this letter are ecclesiological. So Paul unpacks in a negotic way the story of God's people. Israel is chosen in Messiah. Through Israel, the Gentiles share in God's promise. And those in Messiah are to live as God's people, a renewed humanity. That's the big picture. Then in the last three chapters, Paul shifts to halakhic life. Because of these great truths, this is how your community shall live. And we want to remember that Paul is speaking to the community as a whole more than he is to speaking to individuals. So we are to be a community in Messiah that is characterized by love, united in the bonds of peace, and everything we do is to be done to build one another up in Messiah. That's the big picture. Last time, it was maybe a couple months ago, we covered Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 through 20, where Paul gives us a plan for greed and a plan for selfishness. Our communities must be filled with thanksgiving and with joy and song and praise. A community that is renewed in the life of Messiah. Now, this sets us up for our next section today. We call these the household codes in Ephesians 5, 21 through 6 through 9. So Paul discusses how these greater truths that I just kind of reviewed in the letter play out in sub-communities within our wider community, family relationships inside of the home. So let's pull it up on our slides here. And if you have a Bible, you can open up to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 6:9. All right, so it's a longer passage. We're actually going to break it up, but I want to read the whole thing so you can see the picture, because we need this whole passage as a whole first. Okay. Also, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Messiah. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as Messiah also is head of his community. Himself the Savior of the body, but as Messiah's community is submitted to Messiah, so also the wives to their husbands in everything. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Messiah also loved his community and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, having cleansed by immersion in the word. Messiah did this so that he might present himself, his glorious community, not having stain or wrinkle or any such thing, but in order that she might be holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Messiah also does his community, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I'm talking about Messiah and his community. In any case, let each of you love his own wife as himself, and let the wife respect her husband. Okay. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your human masters with respect and with reverence, with sincerity of heart, as you would the Messiah, not just under your master's eye as people pleasers, but as slaves of Messiah, doing God's will from the soul. Serve with a positive attitude as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves the same way. Stop using threats, knowing that the master of them and of you too is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. These are challenging passages, aren't they? These are challenging passages to unpack. Many times people have read, "Wives, submit to your husbands," and then stop there. The language of the submissive wife has been wielded with a heavy hand, at times to silence woman's voice, to suppress her abilities and her value. Slaves, obey your masters, has been used to justify the horrors of the slave trade. Over the centuries and at times, these verses have been used by those in power to manipulate and to control and to abuse the weak. I think that people who want to control people will find ways to do so, and they'll read Bible verses in ways that tells them what they want to hear, while ignoring those verses that challenge and obstruct their goals. So today what I want to do is take a fresh look. And I want to suggest that what Paul is doing, what his intention here for the community of Messiah, is the exact opposite, the way that those verses have been used. These are verses of freedom. And I want to go through this passage honestly and carefully. So what I'm going to do is break this into two parts because it's such a big passage. This time we'll do part one, where we'll cover the latter half of this section, slaves and masters and children and parents, and we'll lay the foundations that's going to lead us into the first half next time, wives and husbands, more carefully next week. So let's start with this overview of the passage first, and then we'll get into some of the verses. So Paul's household code is broken into three kinds of relationships here. We have the relationships between wife and husband, children and fathers, and slaves and masters. So why did Paul choose to focus on these three kinds of relationships? Paul is writing, remember, to these new Gentile believers in Yeshua in Ephesus. Here in the slides is a picture of first century structure at Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. Ephesus was steeped in Greco-Roman culture. Greco-Roman household codes were also common leading up to the first century. It's very interesting. And they focused on these same three relationships. So Paul didn't just make this up. For example, Aristotle's work on governance, he wrote about the role of the husband and the role of the father and the role of the master over the home. And then later thinkers followed suit using the same sequence, husband, father, master. And by the first century, Aristotle's basic values were built into Roman law. Now, Greco-Roman society was built around classes, and it was not easily broken. So people born at the top were viewed as blessed by the gods. They had greater inherent value compared to those who were born into the lower classes. So healthy, strong, wealthy men, husband, father, master, were at the top, favored, imbued with greater virtue. Women, children, and slaves were at the bottom, less so. Aristotle taught that the male head of the household was superior by nature. His household codes instructed the husbands how to rule over his wife, the father how to rule over his children, and the master how to rule with a strong hand over his slaves. Politically, this patriarchy was built into Roman law. Women and children and slaves were considered property, and they didn't have value. That's the culture that we're writing to here. Rome was always concerned about these minority groups that would come and undermine these values. So groups would reiterate these statements in order to demonstrate continuity with Roman law. Imagine if they had a website back then. They would have on their core values, they'd have Aristotle's values of husbands rule over your wives and fathers over your children and masters over your slaves, to signal the authorities that they weren't going to cause a problem. Even Jewish philosopher Philo of the first century portrayed men as superior to women. He contended that masculinity was closer to divinity than femininity, believe it or not. He was Jewish. And Jewish first century historian Josephus wrote how a man should, quote, rule over his wife, his children, and his slaves. Josephus wrote, "The woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, for the authority has been given by God to the man." And then he wrote, "Children are to honor and respect their parents or be stoned. And slaves receive severe punishment for their crimes." I'm trying to set the stage for what Paul's writing here. So the Ephesians wouldn't be surprised to see Paul writing a household code about husbands and wives, fathers and children, and masters and slaves. But here's the key. When you look closely at what Paul has done in his household code, rather than affirm Roman class and patriarchy, Paul opposes them in a dramatic way. Let's look a little bit closer. Paul bookends this whole section with 2 verses. So in 5:21, he says this, "Submit yourselves to," get this, "one another out of reverence for Messiah." Then he talks about wives and husbands, children and fathers, slaves and masters. And then he says this in 6:9, "There is no favoritism in Messiah." That's his big message. Remember, Paul's message in his book to the Ephesians is that in Messiah, you're chosen, you're set apart. Therefore, you must be communities who live differently from the world around you. And I think these framing verses are keys to understanding Paul. Rather than reiterate common patriarchal messaging, which the Ephesians knew it was nothing new for them, this is a radical message of equality. It's a message of mutual submission to one another across sex and classes and roles. So Paul's household codes, it's a striking political statement. You, Messiah's communities, are not in compliance with the Roman way. Instead, they must be set apart from the world around them in their most intimate relationships. In Messiah, one person is not greater than another. All people are made in the image of God, regardless of class and job description and sex and age and roles, even in the intimacy of the home. God does not show favoritism, and neither should you. You must submit to one another in love. Why? Because no matter who we are, we're all under the same submission to the Messiah, and there's no favoritism in him. We're all under the same God. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the text and see how this works its way out. Now, again, to shake things up a bit, I want to work backwards. I think that readers, out of context, pull these verses out, and then they emphasize the husband and wife section here, and rather than see it as a whole. So to highlight the whole passage, let's walk through it in the reverse order, and it will pull the pieces together. So we're going to start at the end with slaves and masters. So you can look at the passage here. I've already read it. Slave owners in Europe and in U.S. use this verse to justify the slave trade. You can just go Google it. I mean, it's absurd. Look, slaves must obey their masters, they said. So Christians in America actually use these words to justify the brutality of African-American slavery. Not all Christians, but there were some. Because Paul seemed to allow it. Slaves, obey your masters. Look, it's right there in the Bible. But Paul's meaning comes alive when we bring it into the context. Now, in our slides, there's a picture of a Roman slave collar used to mark a slave, so they would look different. Roman slavery was not based on ethnic distinction or designation, but on social status. So slaves were people who were either taken as plunder in war, children who were abandoned or stolen or sold, people who were born a slave were a slave. Slaves were considered property in Roman society. They were not considered people. Because they could not legally marry, their children were considered illegitimate. They couldn't own anything. However, in the first century, a slave could be released by his master and then change status and become a Roman citizen, just like anyone else. So that's the idea. At first glance, it might seem as though Paul's supporting slavery, but when we look more closely, it's the opposite. Roman household codes I've mentioned, they were modeled after Aristotle. The Roman man is master, father, husband. They wrote to the Roman man about he should rule over his slaves. They spoke to the masters only because the slave wasn't valued as a person. Here, Paul does something radical. He wrote to the slaves first, as individuals, even to the slaves. And in his context, slaves are all around him. Slaves were also becoming followers of Messiah. While they still had this social status as slaves, they still wore this collar. They still had to follow their masters by Roman law. Paul gives slaves a voice. He speaks directly as equal people that they are to serve, not by serving their human masters as inferiors, but by serving Messiah as equals in the community of Messiah. You may be a slave in this world, and later on in other places he says, if you can get your freedom, get it. But really, you are a servant only to Messiah, just like everyone else. So obey your masters for now if you're unable to be free, but do it as though you are obeying your master, your true master, who is master over all of us together. In this passage, Paul liberates slaves. He says they're no longer slaves to man at all, but slaves to God in Messiah, through whom they will receive their reward just like everyone else. Now, Paul, in the next passage, is even more radical. If you take the context, imagine the Ephesians hearing this. And masters, treat your slaves the same way. So not only did he write to slaves as equal people, now rather than instructing masters to rule their slaves, which is what the Ephesians would have expected, he tells masters to submit in the same way to their own slaves. So for Paul, if slaves are to obey their masters as if serving the Lord, then masters must also obey their slaves as if serving the Lord. He flipped it entirely upside down. And he continues, stop using threats, knowing that the master of them and of you too is in heaven. There's no favoritism with him. So the nature of a slave-master relationship is based on threats. I mean, if a slaveholder can't threaten his slaves because there's no favoritism and there's no sense of hierarchy, then the master can't have slaves at all, unless he were to free them and to protect them under his care. In Roman society, slavery was firmly entrenched into the culture and the law, and the early believers were underground. They had no ability to protest Roman law. So Paul remixes the traditional household codes to cut to the heart of it. Once you value all people as equally made in the image of God, slavery makes no sense. Without addressing it in politics, it undercuts the institution of slavery for believers in Yeshua at the core. So Paul's instructing these early believers how to live differently within the society that they live and find themselves in. In your communities, submit to one another and treat each other as equals in Messiah, and we can take that message to heart today, here. Whether slave or free, whatever place in society you're in, whatever race you're in, however wealthy you are, for us today, whether you're your own boss or you work under someone else or you're managing a household or raising children or some combination, there's no difference. We are all called to serve and to work in all that we do as though we are working for the Lord in righteousness and in integrity, looking for his approval and his pat on the back. So in Messiah, we become servants of one another. That's his message. Now, working backwards in our passage, Paul is doing the same radical remix with parents and children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And he quotes the Torah, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. For Aristotle, the man of the house, again, is to rule and dominate over his children. Romulus wrote that he gave greater power to the father over his son than to the master over his slave. Following this same model that he did with slave, Paul again speaks to the children. He speaks to the children first. You see, it's unheard of. And rather than Roman philosophy, Paul quotes the Torah in his household code. Paul affirms the Torah's importance of instructing to children and while also giving the children value. Paul knows how critical it is that children learn to obey his or her parents, that a child learns to obey. Obedience requires a child to learn how to give up his or her own agenda and desires in order to do things that are difficult in life. It develops a conscience in a child, the ability to do right over wrong when it's harder to do so. It helps a child learn how to process hard feelings like disappointment and anxiety and anger. I have more to say on this topic, but that's for another time, because Paul's point here is that children have value in Messiah. That's his message. And like his message to the slave owners in power, Paul's message to fathers who are in authority is also radical. He doesn't say rule over your children. He does the opposite. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord. For Aristotle, fathers dominate their children in a power-driven relationship. We might think of the image of an angry father lording over his kids while he's still big enough to control them. For Paul, they're not to provoke their children to anger. Now, this isn't an instruction to spoil your kids and to raise selfish children without limits. And to make sure, Paul points us back to Proverbs. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. Proverbs 19:18, discipline or teach your children while there is hope, otherwise you will ruin their lives. So, the Proverbs are not saying just, don't make them angry and raise selfish children, but harshness and yelling can provoke children. Threats, anger provoke children to anger themselves. Favoritism provokes children. Hypocrisy in homes provokes children. Abandonment or being absent emotionally provokes children. And I'm not going to take the time to get into it more here. If you're dealing with some of those things, they're very common in homes, very hard to work with. This is something that I love to work with, have training to work with, and let me know, and I can help. For our purposes in unpacking this passage, just like he did with slaves and masters, Paul is instructing parents and children to both submit to one another in their own unique roles. Children, as people of value, are to obey their parents with honor and with respect, following the Torah. And parents are to use their God-given authority not to lord over their children, but by learning to be patient and gentle and wise, and taking time to invest and to teach and train and practice godly living with their children. So in different ways, parents and children must submit to each other as if they're really serving the Lord, our Messiah, in love. As we close, this sets us up for part 2, which we'll do next time. Paul's resistance to the Roman household codes, his radical approach to slaves and children, is what we need to frame the opening lines about wives and husbands. Again, we'll talk about this next time. The big picture, even more than instructions about how to live, he is telling us how to live. He's giving us some details. But even more than that, Paul's household codes, they need to be read in context. They are resistance narratives to the Roman patriarchy and hierarchical systems of his day. And so Paul's radical message here is that Messiah has set the most vulnerable free, and he has challenged those in authority to follow the love and the sacrificial life of Messiah into the altar of our homes and our communities. So no matter what kind of relationships we're in, we all have lots of different relationships, we must bring the love of Messiah into our hearts and inside of our closest relationships. It needs to be lived out, no matter the costs. Those of us who are in Messiah are to live differently than the world around us. And this is going to become more and more important as the days go on. We are in a tumultuous time in the world. Wars, rumors of wars are very real to us right now. The peace that we want to see in the world must start in our homes. A new life that's filled with order, filled with humility and service and sacrifice, where we defer to one another in love as if deferring to the Messiah, and we treat one another with gentleness and with honor as if to the Messiah that we serve. And it starts inside of our homes and our closest relationships we have. It must characterize our community here, because in Messiah, there is no favoritism. All are made in the image of God. Equally loved. Messiah died for us all the same. Now, treat each other that way. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you. And Cantor Phil, come forward and we'll close our